For more than 50 years, we had in place what was called the Wire Act. The Wire Act had a prohibition on gambling. It's why you couldn't go down to your local bookie or go down to Western Union and start wiring money and betting on who knows what. That was in place until Christmas Eve, the day before Christmas Eve in 2011. And with no input from the public or notice to Congress, a single unelected lawyer in the Office of Legal Counsel, the Department of Justice, released a 13-page memo reversing 50 years of Department of Justice precedent and an understanding that Congress had that the Wire Act was in place to prohibit the use of wires to engage in gambling. The memo that was introduced declared that the Federal Wire Act applied only to sports betting and not to all forms of betting. This reverses what the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Carter administration, and others had interpreted. Now, certainly with the growth and the expansion and difference of the Internet is making on all of our lives, there was this interpretation that didn't come through Congress. It didn't get the proper vetting. There was not the recourse. The point that I've made in sponsoring a piece of legislation that would take us back to Restoring America's Wire Act is that if you want to see a change, if you like a different public policy, if you want to see things done differently, our framers have put forward a process, and that is you introduce a bill, you fight for it, and you try to get it passed into law, passed through the House, passed through the Senate, and signed by the President of the United States. We don't simply make up laws by one attorney at the Department of Justice down in the bowels there at the Department of Justice. We don't erase laws. We shouldn't be creating laws. That's the whole point of this piece of legislation that I had. I believe the piece of legislation that I introduced, Restoring America's Wire Act, is a states' rights bill. There are states, Utah and Hawaii in particular, that have no gaming. Right or wrong, whether you like it or not, the history of the state of Utah, the history of Hawaii is such that we have elected to have no gaming. We don't have a lottery. We have no Indian gaming. We don't have any gaming of any sort. I believe that's the purview of the individual state. If Nevada wants to have it, they've made that choice. You've got a lot of Utahns that will travel to Las Vegas or to Wendover, for instance, and go gambling. That's their choice. But what I don't want is to have gaming coming to Provo, Utah, and Salt Lake City. That's our choice. That's our state's right to say, no, you're not going to be gaming in the state of Utah. That's our decision. And that is the state's right that by pushing gaming online, we're having to deal with. The other challenge that we face is that the Internet doesn't have neat walls around it. It's not like a physical facility that we can say, all right, it works just right here. For anybody to argue that the Internet can be walled off and used in just these certain boundaries, it's a joke. Come on. Nobody with a straight face is going to come before the American people and say, well, the Internet, it's just for the people of Nevada, or it's just for the people of Rhode Island. You kidding me? You give me a good 18-year-olds in about 36 hours and you can hack through just about anything.
I do speak to you from a position of a little bit more knowledge and experience in this issue coming from the state of New Jersey. The law enforcement implications of online gambling are an important policy consideration. However, the evidence clearly demonstrates that with proper regulation, in-state online gambling poses no more challenges to law enforcement or risk to consumers than brick-and-mortar casinos. According to the Department of Justice, in-state online non-sports gambling is not prohibited by the Wire Act or other federal gambling laws, so states may regulate online gambling within their own borders. Currently, the 3 states, New Jersey, Nevada, and Delaware, have asserted their right to allow regulated online borders and have created strong regulatory structures to provide oversight and enforcement of their state regulations. As a member of the New Jersey State Legislature, as the ranking member mentioned, I had the opportunity to vote for myself. I did so because I believe that that legislation offered the best opportunity to mitigate the risk associated with online gambling. Since then, I've been pleased to see that our experience in New Jersey has proven that assessment to be correct. These 3 states have not seen an increase in law enforcement challenges or consumer risks related to regulated online gambling in their state. New Jersey's Director of Gaming Enforcement reported earlier this year, and I quote, "From a regulatory standpoint, our system is working. There have been no major infractions or meltdowns or any systematic regulatory failures that would make any doubt the integrity of operations. The issues that have arisen have been dealt with appropriately, just like in brick-and-mortar casinos." The Division of Gaming Enforcement also established a comprehensive, multi-factor geolocation standard that cross-references multiple location data sources and has the capability to determine if software is being used to hide a device's location. Please take a look at the video screen. This is a slide from the company that's used in New Jersey to enforce the in-state online gambling requirement that play on licensed sites only occurs within the state of New Jersey. Federal law enforcement entities have also not provided evidence of challenges related to regulated online gambling activities in those 3 states. This is contrasted with the significant challenges associated with unregulated offshore online gambling, such as limitations on monitoring transactions and activity on offshore servers and low levels of international cooperation. The unregulated offshore gambling sites are not required to verify a player's age, identity or location, and do not provide the significant evidence trail that regulated online gambling operations provide. The National Fraternal Order of Police wrote in opposition to a ban of online gambling, describing the threats that exist in the unregulated online gambling arena. Not only does the black market for internet gaming include no consumer protections, it also operates entirely offshore with unlicensed operators, drastically increasing the threat of identity theft, fraud, or other criminal acts. There is also evidence that these gaming sites launder money for organized crime and help to finance terrorist networks, and I agree. Any legislative attempts to ban online gambling will drive U.S. patrons to access the unregulated offshore gambling sites that pose greater risk to consumers. A federal ban also interferes with the state's right to decide what gambling is permissible in its borders and the right to create a regulatory framework that protects its citizens. The best way to protect our citizens and support law enforcement is to allow states to establish a regulated system of oversight and enforcement for online gambling that will help drive illegal operators out of the marketplace. And if they are looking to do so, if the states are looking to do so, New Jersey has set a model for regulation that protects its citizens. Other states that choose to allow online gambling can learn from that approach. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The Federal Bureau of Investigation works hard to establish and maintain strong partnerships with both public and private entities in order to combat illegal gambling. One of our priorities has been to work with private sector partners like the American Gaming Association to publicize our Internet Crime Complaints Center, IC3. The IC3 is an online tool which allows the public to report tips about suspected online criminal activity, including illegal gambling. Any discussion of issues concerning online gambling should include the potential for money laundering. Money laundering is broadly defined as any transaction that seeks to conceal or disguise proceeds from illegal activities. Thus, it is any act that converts proceeds gained from illegal activity into assets that appear legitimate. Money laundering can undermine the integrity and stability of financial institutions and systems, discourage foreign investment, and distort international capital flows. We suspect online casinos are potentially susceptible to criminal and money laundering schemes. Online gambling could provide criminal actors with the potential to be anonymous. The use of the Tor network, proxy servers, and encryption through virtual private networks could potentially conceal a player's identity, location, and true gambling activity. Criminal actors could fraudulently manipulate games and conspire with others to use their online gambling accounts to transfer criminally derived funds to each other. A private tournament or game could create a platform allowing one person to transfer funds to another person. Once the private tournament is created, the criminal actor could raise their bet to the maximum permitted bet and then fold or intentionally lose. The movement of funds, which appears as gambling winnings to one and gambling losses to the other, is simply a transfer of criminally derived funds.
What South Carolina's legislature has specifically shut down, DOJ has reopened in another form with a single stroke of a pen. As demonstrated in letters from governors and attorneys general to Congress on this matter, states are befuddled that a 180-degree turn in federal policy on such an important issue was able to occur without public comment or input. Decisions with such broad national policy implications as the 2011 DOJ opinion, which abandoned 50 years of DOJ policy, should be debated by Congress, not left to a lawyer at the Justice Department operating within a vacuum. This unilateral opinion has opened a Pandora's box of enforcement issues for states like South Carolina. Overnight, a DOJ attorney transformed casino gambling from a tightly controlled activity requiring interstate or international travel for South Carolinians to an app on a smartphone available 24/7 with the tap of a finger. While it is reasonable to assume that one day in the future technology will be in place in virtual casinos to prevent these sites from being accessed in another geographic area, the reality is offices like mine, charged with the responsibilities of enforcing our own gambling laws and protecting the public, cannot be expected to rely on the good faith of massive foreign-owned gambling companies licensed by other states. Our system of government reserves intra-state matters, including the regulation of gambling at brick-and-mortar facilities and intrastate lotteries, to the states. But the Internet, as the Justice Department has successfully argued in the courts, is inherently interstate, and so are any gambling casinos offered online. States are ill-equipped to enforce gambling laws against interstate and international companies, particularly given the technological vulnerabilities of the Internet and age and location verification mechanisms that are subject to compromise. The 2011 DOJ opinion endangers citizens of states like South Carolina, especially our children.
In addition to the limited resources available for enforcing the law, prosecution of gambling laws is especially difficult given that online gambling is inherently interstate and often has international implications. It has been my experience that law enforcement issues concerning in-person casino gambling are, for the most part, contained within the general vicinity of the gaming establishment itself. But online gambling easily crosses domestic and international borders and can often be accessed by anyone with Internet access. Several countries have legalized online gambling, and companies host house servers that are accessible to people outside the host country. The primary companies operating these online gaming sites are massive foreign companies against whom it would be nearly impossible for my office, local law enforcement DA, to bring charges. These companies recognize that criminal prosecution by local officials would be very difficult, which creates even more opportunities for these companies to defraud players, launder money for much more dangerous operations. Even more troubling are the risks beyond illegal gambling associated with many online gambling sites. Credit card fraud, identity theft, and other financial crimes can occur when players disclose information that should be kept secure. Unlike other licensed and regulated activities, Internet gamblers often do not know who is operating the gambling site, if the games are honest, if the winnings will be paid, or if the money wager will be used for criminal purposes. Once an individual chooses to engage in online gambling activities, there are few remedies that should they fall victim to a dishonest site. The anonymous, virtual nature of online gambling also increases opportunity to gamble more frequently. As I left my office yesterday, we had 2 new felony cases come in just from people who had gambling issues, and they obviously committed other crimes because of their gambling problems. As a county attorney, I prosecuted numerous crimes stemming from gambling issues, including white-collar crimes involving significant sums of money to neglect cases from parents not caring for their children due to gambling issues. Easy access to gambling is particularly dangerous to young people, who are 2 to 3 times more likely to develop a gambling problem. The Mayo Clinic compares the physiological impact of gambling to the impact drugs have on our brain's reward system. From a mental and emotional perspective, pathological gamblers are at an increased risk to develop stress-related conditions, major depressive episodes, anxiety disorders, or substance abuse issues. Compulsive gambling can also lead to financial loss, increased crime, lost time at work, bankruptcies, strained relationships with family members, and even homelessness. Finally, Online gambling activities are extremely difficult to monitor because users can remain largely anonymous. Law enforcement often has limited tools to identify who is gambling illegal and from where they are engaging in the unlawful activity. Any smartphone, tablet, or laptop can be a vehicle for online gambling, and it is virtually impossible to pinpoint players who sign on from isolated networks.
I am Mark Liprelli, and I was asked to present a result of the emphasis of my work for the past 7 years and my over 22 years of experience in the gaming technology field. In January of 2009, I was appointed by the governor of my state to the Nevada Gaming Control Board, and in January of 2011, I was elevated to the position of chairman. I also served on our state's gaming policy committee that adopted support of regulated interactive gaming in our state. This is relevant because during my tenure on the board, our state embarked on creating the first set of gaming regulations governing legal interactive gaming in the United States. I concluded my tenure on the Gaming Control Board in October of 2012, and since that time have provided advisory work to a number of entities engaged in the gaming, technology, sports, and investment sectors. I'm also the co-founder of the International Center for Gaming Regulation at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and currently serve as a Nevada State Senator. I would add that prior to serving on the board, I spent 15 years in senior management positions with some of the industry's leading gaming technology providers. The comments I make today are my own. As you continue to review iGaming and the related role of law enforcement, I can tell you confidently your committee is now in a position to benefit from a significant amount of deliberation and contribution from many well-informed and experienced operators, regulators, technologists, and industry experts. Unlike 2009, we are no longer in greenfield. We have learned a great deal in the past 6 years. The creation of enabling law and regulation in 3 states and a large number of informed studies and debates, as well as, perhaps most importantly, the creation, testing, and deployment of many iGaming systems throughout the world has created concrete knowledge that does now and should replace speculation. A healthy portion of the knowledge gained also comes from international markets that by our U.S. standards are not highly regulated. From a regulatory and law enforcement perspective, Nevada, New Jersey, and Delaware have been successful. Where there were concerns over licensing, protecting children and the vulnerable, player protection, tax collection, money laundering, and geolocation, these states have had good success. I have provided further discussion of these items in my full remarks. We know there have been many attempts to compromise these systems, but those issues are being revealed, thwarted, evaluated, and where warranted, new standards are implemented. This is a hallmark of gaming regulation of the traditional casino business. I would provide praise to my former colleagues in Nevada for beginning this effort, and particular praise of the efforts of Dave Rebuck in the New Jersey Division of Gaming Enforcement. Unlike Nevada, where regulations currently authorize only online poker, New Jersey chose to implement all forms of gaming. This no doubt expanded the scope of the effort and the energy to get it right. Like any innovation, ongoing diligence and continued product improvements will be necessary to meet the constant work of those who seek to compromise laws and regulations. The 3 existing U.S. markets and several regulated markets in Canada have now applied their knowledge to actual operations, and historical speculation has given way to their success and foundation knowledge. Future regulatory agencies that consider iGaming legislation will be subject to inquiry from those seeking clarity on the subject of licensing, product submissions, site approvals, employee registrations. These questions have been widely debated, tested, and largely addressed. To the degree possible, I have advised governments, law enforcement, and regulatory policy advisors to provide for broad statutory framework, but leave the specific requirements to the regulations. This approach gives regulators, the experts in the field, more opportunity to adjust to changing technology and provide flexibility where appropriate. Depending on the underlying products that may be introduced in the future, it is important that law enforcement and regulators strike an appropriate balance of clarity and regulatory policy. Where the intent is to allow full commercial-styled casino games, a more robust form of oversight is likely warranted. Where there are other forms of online gaming entertainment that fall short of these definitions, lighter forms of regulation may suffice. I have a couple concluding remarks. One, I would not leave this subject without specific reference to what I consider to be the much bigger policy challenge. In my opinion, illegal gaming operators need to be put in the spotlight. These operators continue to exist in the shadows and enjoy untaxed and unregulated operations. This is an area where states that have authorized gaming and those that have not need to work together with federal law enforcement to continue to reveal these rogue operators. It is a continual effort, but cooperation between all levels of government, financial institutions, and licensed operators is critical. If illegal, non-taxing operators are allowed to freely compete untested and with unregulated products, the playing field will remain unlevel and consumers will be unprotected. Nevada, New Jersey, and Delaware, as well as many test labs, have begun to reverse this trend. In the short and long term, the lasting impacts on licensed operators will be significant. This knowledge must be shared with other states and the federal government as policies are shaped. Number two, the pace of U.S. legalization has to date been modest. This has largely abated concerns 5 years ago that iGaming would spread too quickly without proper oversight and without actual knowledge that it could be effectively regulated. Even with our law in Nevada in place for over 15 years, we remain only a poker jurisdiction, and several states, after study, elected not to proceed with iGaming legislation. Three, there's a host of attendant businesses that desire further clarity around iGaming policy. These include financial institutions, handset providers, network providers, credit card issuers, and many others. In nearly every case, they too seek the advantage of legal markets and seek to avoid those who are not providing such clarity. Four, technology's innovation is taking place at a higher and higher speed, and consumers are adopting mobile preferences. Newer technology to protect state choices on allowing or prohibiting iGaming is getting stronger and more diverse. For example, the proximity of New Jersey to New York and Pennsylvania highlights these protections in operation. Five, consistency in iGaming regulation is very important. The security of any system is made more difficult if we end up with an application code that varies widely from market to market. If policy changes are considered, this should be kept firmly in mind. And lastly, you have no doubt heard and will continue to hear from those who suggest that the risks are simply too great or that you cannot be given complete assurance that legal iGaming can be properly governed. As chairman, these concerns were very real for me. No other state had taken up the regulation of iGaming, and we had a 75-year history to protect. My governor, himself a former Gaming Commission chair, attorney general, and federal judge, made it clear to me that outside risk was not in his or our state's interest. However, after spending 6 years with experts in the field, developers of products, independent test labs, and regulators from Alderney, the United Kingdom, Gibraltar, France, Italy, Malta, and the Isle of Man, Singapore, and many others, I can give you confidence that the regulated market model does work. That said, you must be willing to accept that this market, like any market, is not entirely bulletproof. As markets grow, there will no doubt be challenges. I expect we will uncover new risks that we did not anticipate despite our exhaustive efforts. State regulators and independent test labs have and will continue to act to address those challenges.
How big of a priority is this, and how prevalent of a problem is it compared to, say, terrorism for the FBI, compared to terrorism, insider trading, counterfeiting, political corruption? Is it more important than any of those?
Well, it fits into the priority in the sense that as we go after critical organizations that can hurt America, and again, whether those are transnational organized crime groups, other criminal enterprise groups, terrorism, et cetera, we look for any and all violations that those individuals are involved in, and certainly if it involves online gaming, we're going to pursue that threat and fully investigate that aspect. In addition, as information comes to us whereby online gaming may be occurring in an illegal manner or promoting those types of threats, we're going to drive most definitely as a priority.
But your testimony is that today, so far, you are not aware of any terrorism that's been financed using Internet gambling in any of the 3 states.
As I said, I can take that back, and we can do some further analysis.
But right
and
now,
determine.
you're not aware.
But as I sit here, I do not have that answer.
Can't, Mr. Campbell, following up, can't states just pass laws to prevent their own citizens from gambling on the Internet?
Well, certainly it's up to the states to determine how they might want to police online gaming. From our perspective, we use a number of statutes, the illegal gambling business statute, unlawful Internet Gaming Act as well, the Travel Act, the money laundering statutes, bank fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, et cetera. And we partner with states in investigations and prosecutions.
Attorney General Wilson, same question for you. Can't your state just pass laws regulating this in your state?
It's my opinion that it would not be practical for states on a state-by-state and a quilt-like matter to pass laws on something that the federal law has passed unanimously across all 50 states.
Is that because of enforcement?
It was very difficult from an enforcement purpose. I mean, it's extremely difficult to enforce.
Well, here's my concern, and my next question is for Mr. Liparelli. And I want to know if you have the same concern that I do, that if we pass a national online gambling prohibition under the presumption that it's necessary for federal legislation to essentially overturn state laws to deal with a state problem on it, because they don't want to do it on a state-by-state basis. Couldn't that logic be used in the same way with gun control, for instance? Because if a state's allowed to sell guns in one state, that makes enforcement of gun control laws in another state difficult. Isn't there sort of the same logic at play there, or do you share that concern?
I wasn't prepared to discuss gun control in today's hearing, but what I would say to that question
Well,
is...
let's just back it up to the 10th Amendment then.
Right. What I would say to that question are two things. State laws that exist today that either authorize or make illegal gaming operations apply every bit as much to something that is exposed on the Internet as it would be in a brick-and-mortar facility. For example, in the state of Nevada, you are no more... You no more have a right to expose a gambling game on the Internet as you do going down the street and opening up a building without a gaming license. So those state laws apply regardless, so that would be my response. A state law already prevails regardless of whether it's Internet or not.
So just in closing, I would say that I do have that concern, that if we use this logic at the federal level, that it's hard to enforce, for instance, gun control laws in one state, so we have to have a universal ban. That seems like the same logic that we're using here by prohibiting Internet gaming. That's just my concern, Mr. Chairman, and thank
you. The 3 states that have created a regulatory framework to allow license on have already greatly reduced the risk of collusion of money laundering through the regulated sites. And Mr. Campbell, I need to ask you, has the FBI had any successful convictions of a regulated gambling operator, or have you seen an increase in criminal activity through the regulated gambling sites?
So for those businesses that are operating illegally outright, however, we do look at information that we receive that could demonstrate that a regulated gambling business might be acting illegally. I think an important point to make is that individual subjects, criminals, could still be utilizing any legal gambling business for illegal activities such as money laundering and then to support other illicit criminal activity.
Possibly. However, has the FBI any record of these instances that I've asked about?
I don't have the specific details regarding that. I can take that back and see whether that does in fact exist.
And whether or not you've seen an increase in criminal activity on those sites. The other thing, Mr. Campbell, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the challenges that the FBI faces in going after illegal online gambling schemes that are unregulated and offshore, and are there measures to counteract those challenges on the regulated sites?
Well, certainly as with any investigation, whether it's nationally or globally based, we're going to utilize all investigative techniques in order to gather information about what criminal activity may be occurring, which includes working with our state, local, federal, and private sector partners, and even foreign government partners related to that particular threat. So regardless of the circumstance, we're going to apply the same techniques and utilize every capability to obtain evidence for a prosecution.
I can appreciate that. So I just kind of want to, for the record, in that might be the case, you have not come here today with any particular knowledge about problems of this nature in the 3 states that have the regulated online gambling. Is that, and you would have to find out if there's such a record and let us know. Is that right?
That's correct. I would have
Thank you,
to
Mr. Cameron.
provide you some other information on that. That's correct, yes.
With a little bit of time that I have left, I'd like to contrast the kind of challenges that have been discussed here by the panel with what happens when states do regulate online operations. And so, Mr. Liberelli, I'd like to know from you, from your experience, what controls are in place in regulated online gambling sites that make it easier to catch attempts at criminal activity like money laundering or collusion?
It's a very fair question. One thing that is probably misrepresented too many times in the public is the U.S. regulated industry of iGaming dramatically differs from our counterparts in most foreign jurisdictions. We set in place what many people in foreign jurisdictions criticize us as a very tight system. So everything from player registration all the way down to player transactions is completely transparent to the regulator. So there is a relational database that identifies issues associated with potential fraud, collusion, player manipulation, credit issuance, the laundering of money. It would be my considered opinion that if you were going to try to launder money, a legal regulated site would probably be the last place that you'd want to try to do that. From a law enforcement perspective, the tools we put in place are quite robust and would lead, right to the doorstep of those that were using a legal site for those kinds of purposes.
I know that no system can be perfect and no enforcement effort is actually perfect. But to your knowledge, are there sufficient layers of identification requirements that would ensure that an individual is playing from a legalized state in a state that has regulated gambling?
There are.
Geolocation issue.
There are, to answer your question directly, and separately beyond that, it's not just simply identifying the IP address. The standards that I think were referenced by one of the witnesses here relate to very specific knowledge of the location of the transaction. It also incorporates tools that require users to disable certain functions on their computer so as to prevent people from disguising their location. If those applications are actually operating while the site is accessed, the site will deny access. So there are a number of technical standards that have been put in place and tested to prevent that from happening.
Help me, because when I heard you were coming up, I was excited, but I didn't expect you to be on this side of this issue. You've taken some positions that I support in other areas, from health care to gay marriage to EPA regulation. You've been taking the position against federal control, which and I read your testimony today, not the stuff that you were able to get to when you opened, but your testimony is got some really good lines in it. The members of this committee should recognize that under our Constitution, particularly the 10th Amendment, the states have virtually exclusive authority over gambling. Each state is entitled to decide for itself how or to whether altogether. Congress has always recognized the preeminent state interest in gambling regulation. I could go on. And then to have you come up and take a position here that sounds like you're for federal control, I can't square those two things. I've got this last quote, which says that the DOJ opinion strikes at the very heart of it should not legalize gambling activities that states make illegal. I get that, and I agree with that. The federal government should not legalize stuff that the states have made illegal. But I'm waiting for the other half of that statement, Mr. Chairman, which is, should the federal government also make illegal that which other states have made legal? And there's 3 states who have done that. So help me square these two things.
I'm going to ask, first off, let me say this. I'm not up here, I'm not going to speak for anyone else today, I'm not up here to say that gambling should be made illegal. I think if New Jersey, my wife's from New Jersey, love your state, if New Jersey or other states want to have a robust gambling industry, they should be free to pursue that. The members in this room who want that should be allowed to have it.
But if the bill passes, that's why she's here. She's
We're
afraid if the
talking
bill passes, she loses the right to do that.
What
in
we're
her state.
talking about is interstate commerce, which Congress has the authority to regulate under Article 1, Section 8. There is no dispute up here that Congress can write the Wire Act, that Congress can regulate online gambling because it's interstate in nature. That is not the dispute. If
Alan, let me stop you there, because I think that's right. And I hope we're moving to an area we can agree on, because I'm wondering if there's not a better way to do what we want to do in South Carolina, where it's not legal, but still allow New Jersey and Nevada to do what they want to do, which is to use technology instead of regulation. If we could figure out a way to make sure that only New Jersey residents gambled online in licensed New Jersey enterprises using technology, isn't that another way to accomplish what you want to accomplish?
I believe that if, online gambling, if it's allowed by the federal government, you're basically putting every pocket of every teenager or young person who wants to be able to access it.
I get that, but in your testimony, what you say is that the reinterpretation essentially allows states to operate online casinos in states like Nevada, Delaware, New Jersey, without any assurance that these online casinos are not being accessed in states like South Carolina. You also say that the original Wire Act, with respect to states' rights and prerogatives, should thus be restored so that casino gambling does not operate over the Internet in the states which have outlawed it in their communities. And what I'm asking you is, isn't there perhaps another way to prevent kids in South Carolina from accessing gambling sites, legal gambling sites in New Jersey, Nevada, or Delaware, other than federal regulation?
And I don't know that that way exists. I heard Ms. Coleman eloquently say that she believes as a matter of policy that verification can be enforced. I saw the little points up there on the map. I don't know if those were 18-year-olds or if people crossed the river to gamble. But the point is that if you make online gambling legal at the federal level, then you've basically legalized it in states where they don't want gambling at all.
Your objection to this is not that the information might state lines in the process of going a person in South Carolina access something in Nevada. That's the interstate nexus for you here, correct?
Correct.
So if we could figure out a way to fix that, I would simply suggest if there's a way to fix it through technology that Mr. Liparelli has mentioned, maybe that is an alternative and less intrusive way to deal with the issue, and here's why I care. And I have all the respect for my colleague from New Jersey, but unbeknownst to you and maybe the other folks on the committee, in fact, maybe folks on the committee here, she's introduced a bill that has a lot of similarities to what Mr. Massey mentioned earlier, which is to ban Internet ammunition and gun sales through a similar requirement to what you've just been talking about here, by making people actually show up in person to show their ID. I can't remember the name of the bill he's seen. And that's one of my fears here, is that they're asking you to, instead of being consistent in the state rights position, to come out and say, well, here's a place where we really do need federal intervention so that people in South Carolina can't access legal Internet gambling in Nevada, and then use it as to say, oh, by the way, it really is hard for New Jersey to enforce our state laws on gun control because you can just go online and buy one in South Carolina. And that's what I'm worried about, is that we're going to go through regulation and expand the role of the federal government as opposed to limit it.
I'm listening to all this, and if I were a judge listening to this, the first question I would want to get to is the bottom line. And what I said in my opening statement is about money. Would you agree that if we were to outlaw online gambling, that the bricks and mortar people would make more money? Anybody disagree? I don't see any disagreement down there. And I guess the reason why I'm getting to that is because, we in the Congress, but I don't, have the kind of money that the big players are playing with. And we have to we're trying to figure out how to deal with this dispute. But there's some things that are coming through from what you're saying that I think we can kind of get down to the bottom line of this. It sounds like the issue of illegal gambling, which I think all of us want to get rid of illegal gambling. That's one thing, Mr. Campbell. And my question is so you don't feel that you have the tools to deal with the illegal gambling? Hold that for a second, hold that. And then I want to come to you, Mr. Liparelli. let me ask you, with you, it sounds like what you're saying, if we can steer more gamblers, in other words, if the states can do the regulating, then a lot of the problems that Mr. Campbell talks about should be resolved, because you use the term relational database. What he's talking about is information. And you're saying we're getting the information that would actually allow him to do a more effective job. Am I missing something? Because this is what it seems like everything that you all have said. To me, this whole thing boils down to what I just said. Help me.
Mr. Cummings, the requirements that we put in place were exactly that. If we're going to allow online gaming, there will be player registrations, there will be complete tracking of activity, so that to the extent these sites were ever to be used or attempted to be compromised, the audit trail or the transparency trail is there for the regulators. So the quick answer to your question is yes, we want players to move to and off of illegal gaming sites. That's often missed in this discussion, is these illegal sites are readily available to all the U.S. public. They were available prior to 2011 letter that was, or the opinion that was authored. They were available. And by the way, the reference of the chairman with respect to the substantial fines that were paid by people who broke the law, who were illegal. Those weren't legal regulated sites that paid those fines. Those were people that were trafficking in our country, in our states, who ran to the steps of the Justice Department and said, we want to get right, and we're willing to pay to do that.
So now, Mr. Campbell, can you answer my question? I gave you some time to think about it.
Certainly, sir. As I mentioned earlier, we use a variety of statutes to go after individuals and organizations that are involved in illegal online gambling. And then, of course, we use statutes such as those and others then to target those criminal organizations that are using online gaming to support other types of more serious and nefarious criminal activity, like human trafficking, like narcotics trafficking, corruption, that type of thing. So we use a variety of tools in order to target that particular threat.
Before I begin my questions, I've got to make it perfectly clear that personally I am opposed to all gambling in every shape, form, or fashion, be it in person or online or whatever it may be. Having been a pastor for over 25 years, I've personally seen the destruction of various addictions, and gambling being among them. So this type of hearing puts me somewhat in a quandary to begin with, because I am opposed to gambling altogether. And I fully agree with Georgia's governor, Nathan Deal, who has publicly opposed the construction of a casino in Metro Atlanta, and who I also know for a fact opposes any lottery offerings that resemble casino games. So I'm opposed to gambling. But that being said, I'm also a supporter of the 10th Amendment and our Constitution and the right of states. And whether the fact is the people of Georgia voted to have a lottery. And there's no question that the Georgia lottery has contributed over $1 billion to the Hope Scholarship and pre-K education since its inception in 1994. No one can deny the contribution to those programs. And I also know that the Georgia lottery has been in recent years exploring online sales, and in fact they've contributed and invested a considerable amount of money to ensure that those sales that customers make are in accordance with both state and federal law. So all that being said, my first question is really to each of you in a brief answer, but if the technology exists to ensure that online sales are kept away from minors and kept within the state of Georgia alone, why does the federal government have a role to play? Or does it? I'll just start, Mr. Campbell, with you.
Right. So I'm not here to take a particular position in regard to all the aspects of your question, but just again to reiterate that the FBI enforces the laws as they exist, and as we receive information about criminal activity, that's really our role.
Mr. Wilson.
The Wire Act was originally ushered in through the Kennedy administration when then U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy was the Attorney General for the United States in an effort to help states. There is no violation of state sovereignty or 10th Amendment because Congress has the authority under Article 1, Section 8 to regulate interstate commerce. A brick-and-mortar building is not—
Talking about in the state of Georgia, though, not interstate. If the
online—
technology is there to stay within the state, what role does the federal government have? That's my question. And please be quick. I've got just a couple of minutes left.
If it crosses state lines in an Internet transaction, you have a role in that regard.
That is not my question, though. Mr. Klein?
Well, the very essence of what we're talking about here is the Internet has such interstate complications. As a local prosecutor, that's what we're looking for, is help from the federal government to say, hey, we can't handle this, and I'm not aware of any way. If Nebraska said, we want to ban the Internet, there's no way that's going to happen. People are going to have access to the Internet. So we're looking for help
what would you
here.
say?
The technology exists to keep it within the state border, so in your direct question shortly is that there wouldn't be a role in that sense.
Of the federal government.
There may be business ideas down the line that may incorporate multi-state activities, but the quick answer to your question is they wouldn't have a role.
Okay, Mr. Campbell, are you aware of any circumstances where the Georgia Lottery has failed to comply with state or federal law?
As I sit here, I really do not have any information about the Georgia Lottery in general, sir.
Okay. Well, my time is wrapping up, but it just seems to me that the federal government should not be dictating to the states how they operate their state lotteries or casinos, state-sanctioned casinos, if those states have chosen to go that route. And, I mean, we've got to protect the 10th Amendment, whether or not we like the gambling issue as a whole. And frankly, if there's any legislation that infringes upon states' rights in that regard, I believe it flies right in the face of our constitutions and the limited powers that the Constitution provides.
As I've heard the testimony, I've been pretty astounded that Mr. Campbell could come representing the FBI to talk about the problems of regulated Internet gaming and not be able to cite a single case in which it's been the problem or give us any statistics that indicate it is a problem. And Attorney General, how you can use the 10th Amendment argument to say that federal regulation gives you more states' rights is kind of jabberwocky to me. And also, I wonder if you're so concerned about somebody in South Carolina, gambling on a site that's located in, regulated by, and limited to Nevada, what you're doing to protect those teenagers with a cell phone in South Carolina from gambling illegally and overseas. But I'd really like to have my time spent by Mr. Liparelli sharing with us how our extensive background in regulation of gaming in bricks and mortar has helped us to develop regulation for online gaming and answer some of the questions where people say, well, if you're in South Carolina, you can gamble on a site that's located in Nevada. How, when you cross the line to California, those sites turn off, how we can regulate those sorts of things. Would you lay some of that out for the committee? And I would be glad to welcome any members of the committee to come to Nevada for a tour and a visit and see how this really does work.
Thank you, Ms. Tives, for the question. All of the gaming regulation that has been passed throughout the United States essentially have 4 tiers, and I think it's important to highlight those. It's the statutory framework, the regulatory framework, and most people understand those 2 tiers pretty well. What many people don't realize that below those tiers are a series of technical standards, and then beyond the technical standards are the interpretations of those technical standards by staff. So to represent that someone can anonymously play on a regulated Internet site is completely inaccurate. You have full-blown registration requirements that mandate people turn over Social Security numbers, personal identification, and by the way, all of their activity, all of their wagers, all of their deposits, all of their withdrawals, all of their head-to-head matches are all recorded within the system. So to suggest that regulated sites can operate in anonymity or without transparency, I believe is completely inaccurate. So in the case of illegal operators, that's very possible, and that's been part of my testimony, is you have this dichotomy of the illegal people that probably are exploiting customers in South Carolina, and I'm confident that they're exploiting customers in every state in the country. In the case of Nevada and New Jersey's probably a better example because they've adopted all forms of gaming. Those same stringent technical standards and rules interpretations apply. So the technical people that are assigned to approve these systems, this is a privileged industry, and you don't just get your product approved because you submit it. The burden is always on the applicant to prove that their system meets the technical standards. So there's no free pass when it comes to deploying these systems.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson, Mr. Klein, for your public service. Thank you for your testimony today, and I have no doubt you believe in your testimony, but I do need to point out that parts of your testimony was simply wrong when it comes to technology. Mr. Klein, you had testified essentially that any smartphone can be used for online gambling, and that's virtually impossible to pinpoint location. And then, Mr. Wilson, you said essentially that any smartphone can be used as a virtual casino. The notion that you can't pinpoint location is simply incorrect. Just look at your GPS next time on your smartphone. It'll tell you where you are relatively accurately. And if you have lots of folks who are using these devices, they are going to be able to do it within their own state, but not outside the state in terms of online gambling. When you look at the programs that these states have put in, they're relatively effective. So we have a video that we're going to show from one such geolocation company. It's called GeoComply. We're going to show it. It's about a minute and a half. And as it's queuing up, I want to note,
For anybody to argue that the internet can be walled off and used in just these certain boundaries, it's a joke. Come on. Nobody with a straight face is going to come before the American people and say, well, the internet, it's just for the people of Nevada, or it's just for the people of Rhode Island. You kidding me?
the notion that you have ordinary South Carolina citizens who are somehow playing a Las Vegas online casino has no basis in reality or fact. And that's because they can't access that. Las Vegas and Nevada will block these things, so will New Jersey. So we're going to show this one for GeoComply, which New Jersey uses, and if we want to run the video, that'd be great.
Today's high demand for online poker and casino, as well as regulators requiring licensed operators to only accept bets within permitted states, requirements for geolocation compliance are high and regulations are tight. GeoComply are a licensed service provider in 100% of the regulated iGaming market, as well as verified and audited by leading testing authorities. Federal regulations such as UEGA shape the technical requirements by state regulators, which mandate pinpoint accurate data, as seen in this transaction, where GeoComply systems captured the player's location within meters of accuracy, just less than a mile from the excluded New York border, of every transaction processed. Regulations also require multiple data sources. This transaction shows GeoComply capturing IP, Wi-Fi, and GPS data. Although IP data is always collected, as a sole data source, it is considered vulnerable to millions of easy-to-use VPNs and proxies. Mandated spoofing detection identifies and blocks players' transactions associated with VPNs and proxies. Spoofing detection also verifies remote desktop software and virtual machines are not active during a gaming session. As displayed on the right side of this transaction, GeoComply collects and analyzes all running processes on a player's device to verify none can be used to tamper with location data. If the player tries to use a running process,
Thank you. My colleague, Mr. Mulvaney, earlier today asked, is there a less intrusive way to solve this problem? We just showed it to you. And there are ways to make sure that folks are not playing illegally. Now, is it possible that a very smart hacker could spend countless hours trying to hack into one of these systems? Sure, anything's possible. But then we've got much more to be worried about that hacker than if that person from South Carolina wants to play, for example, the Illinois State Lottery online. And then let me ask some questions for Mr. Liparelli. In Nevada, For someone to actually play online, they've got to give their name, their address, their driver's license, their bank account, a whole host of other information, correct?
That is correct, sir.
But if they walk in a brick-and-mortar casino, they can walk in, put $5,000 on black on the roulette wheel, win, and then walk out without giving their name or address or driver's license, correct?
They can do that, but the marketing department at the casino will more likely track them down and try to get that information
Right.
from them.
So let's say they win 1,000. Now, based on what you said earlier, it seems like with online regulated gambling, you have far more information on who it is, what their bank account is. So they, in fact, are not anonymous. In the same way we don't say online banking is anonymous, we don't say online stock trading is anonymous. This is not anonymous. This is almost the exact opposite. You have so much information about these people who are online gambling that this is exactly what law enforcement wants. And I do want to suggest that what, some of the witnesses are arguing today are essentially that South Carolina should decide what the other 49 states should do. That is wrong. That violates the 10th Amendment. And with that, I yield back.
So I have an interest in this because in 2001, the United States Virgin Islands passed the Internet Gaming and Internet Gambling Act. And over the past decade, the government of the Virgin Islands has really been handcuffed by incorrect interpretations, they believe, of the Wire Act. And I believe that if the act was allowed to be implemented and regulated properly, much needed revenue might be brought to many different states that have this law in its place. So I was really interested in a much more historical look back on how this came about. I've worked at the Department of Justice, worked in the Deputy Attorney General's office, and understand how long it takes for an opinion to come out of legal counsel, the Department of Legal Counsel. So the idea that this was drafted and written and signed in the middle of the night, to me, is somewhat a stretch of my imagination, knowing the inner workings of the Justice Department and how long it takes for an opinion to come out. So I wanted to look at the interaction between the Justice Department and Congress over the many years in which before that opinion was drafted. So Mr. Klein, I understand that in 2002 there was a case called In Re MasterCard in which the Fifth Circuit Appellate Court ruled that the Wire Act applied only to online sporting betting. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay, that's your understanding. And that the Fifth Court made that decision, that would have been 9 years before the Department of Justice's legal opinion, correct?
That's also what my...
Okay, and since then, during that time, 2009, even before that, Congress has weighed in pretty consistently on this issue up until now, that there seems to be some question about it. So, Mr. Wilson, were you aware that between 1996 and 2006, Congress passed a series of bills to update the Wire Act and made it clear that the act should not apply to online casino operators duly licensed by a state to offer casino games to people located in those states?
Into which, I'm sorry, which states?
To any state.
To any
This was an
state,
act passed by Congress.
No, I'm not.
Okay, and were you aware that Representative Goodlatte in the 106th, 107th, 108th, 109th Congress offered legislation on this matter? Senator John Kyle, Representative Leach as well?
No.
Okay, and that even though none of these laws was enacted, the passage of those bills in both congressional houses gave a clear evidence that I would think that there is congressional intent on this matter. So in 2006, Congress enacted the only law that deals directly with Internet gaming. Are all of the witnesses, are you familiar with the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act, otherwise known as UGIA? Are you all aware of that? I take that as a yes?
Yes.
Okay. I don't want to go into lawyer mode and, okay. Thank you. So I'd ask that the record reflect that all of the witnesses says that they're aware of that. And I have a slide that I'd like to show. Here's what UGIA said, that the term unlawful Internet gambling does not include placing, receiving, or otherwise transmitting a bet or wager where a bet or wager is initiated or received or otherwise made exclusively within a single state. And then it goes on to say the bet or wager and the method by which the bet or wager is initiated and received or otherwise made is expressly authorized by and placed in accordance with the laws of such state. And finally, and the state law or regulations include age and location verification requirements reasonably designed to block access to minors and persons located out of such state, and appropriate data security standards to prevent unauthorized access by any person whose age and current location has not been verified in accordance with such state laws or regulations. Mr. Liparelli, is that the correct pronunciation of your name, sir?
Yes, it is.
Okay, I'm pretty sensitive to that myself. Is it clear to you from the reading of this law that Congress never intended to ban states from authorizing and regulating online gambling within their own borders?
The language debated in and around UGA was intense, and I believe you're correct that that was the intent.
The final intent and what the language of the law itself says.
Yes, I do.
And so, Mr. Liparia, did the state of Nevada consider this language in drafting its own regulations?
It did, and I would remind the committee that we actually passed our state law back in 2001, so the adoption of UGA actually was part of what informed our regulatory structure. The regulations are controlled by our Nevada Gaming Commission, so clearly they, at the advice of our Attorney General, considered the elements within UGA when we adopted our regulations.
So this legislation, which was passed incidentally in a Republican-controlled Congress and signed into law by President Bush, that the department, were you aware that this was, this precise language of UGA is what the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel utilized in determining that it was needed to update DOJ's position to conform with Congress and with the courts?
I believe that's correct.
Mr. Campbell, are there other statutes that the federal government could use to prosecute the unregulated illegal online gambling?
Yes, that is correct. We use the Illegal Gambling Business Act, the Travel Act, various money laundering statutes, bank fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, among others, in order to target that type of threat and, of course, organizations and individuals involved in that activity.
And what's the purpose of the Wire Act being used in this way, then?
I can only refer to the opinion itself and the Department's interpretation of the statute.
Are there any, is there evidence of any regulated entities using the gambling opportunities for money laundering?
I'm sorry, the regulated...
The online gambling.
Well, there is evidence of criminals utilizing those forums potentially for
Have you prosecuted any cases? Has the Department of Justice brought any cases based on that theory?
I would have to refer to them and maybe provide some other information related to that. I'm not, as I sit here, I can't define specific cases involving the money laundering aspect.
And are there cases that criminals have used brick and mortar casinos to launder money?
Again, I'd have to refer back to provide you some more information regarding that.
Well, I can answer that one for you. I prosecuted some of those. So it's happened at brick and mortar casinos.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you need this statute then? Why couldn't you use other statutes to prosecute these cases if you can in other, in the brick and mortar situation?
Well, certainly we are utilizing these various statutes. That's correct in regard to any criminal activity, illegal activity relating to gaming. That is correct.
Mr. Wilson, do you worry that if the federal government goes down this path, that the federal government could also go down the path of legalizing gambling in all states?
I mean, I suppose I haven't put much thought into them legalizing gambling. It's always been the policy of them to leave that solely within the purview of the states. That's always been the policy of the Congress, is give great deference to the states and how to regulate gambling. I don't see that changing, but...
Well, you're seeing a change now. I mean, we're having a hearing based on states' rights.
I'm seeing an erosion, yes, sir.
I would really like to focus on the law enforcement aspect of this, and the National Fraternal Order of Police submitted a letter to the committee expressing their law enforcement perspective on regulating online gambling. and I'd like unanimous consent to place their letter in the record. And I'd like to quote from the letter. It says, quote, "It is imperative that states be able to reserve the right to create a strong regulatory framework to allow law enforcement to successfully protect consumers and to drive illegal operators out of the marketplace." So, Mr. Liparelli, as you have experience in this area, would you agree that a strong regulatory framework for online gambling would support law enforcement efforts, consumer protections, and drive illegal operators out of the business and the marketplace?
Clearly, I believe that should be the priority of both state and federal law enforcement. This was an issue prior to our state's legalization and regulation of online gaming, and it only became more apparent once there were economic interests, quote unquote, in the game, where they themselves were able to analyze the impact of those operating illegally without paying taxes and registering customers without any form of serious confirmation. So clearly the answer to that is yes.
Okay, Mr. Campbell, I'm guessing or assuming that a strong regulatory framework aids the FBI's efforts if investigating a player or transaction related to a regulated online gambling operation or platform.
Well, certainly both statutory law and regulation can have an effect in regard to ensuring operators continue their operations within the law. That is true.
And Mr. Liparelli, some states have concerns about the difficulty and cost of regulating online gambling within their state borders. Can you please share some insight from your experience in Nevada drafting the state regulations for oversight?
I can certainly speak to our experience in Nevada. I was chairman at the time we adopted these regulations, and at that moment in time, we added no new resources in terms of human capital to our agency. We did it within the confines of our existing staffing levels. It's an important question. There was, I believe, some cyber resources added in our just past legislative session. I think the better question with regard to that relates to empowering law enforcement potentially in other ways to potentially go after, the illegal operators. There are state laws on the books today that clearly delineate those as illegal activities, so there are tools in place already, but if there's a desire to enhance that capability, you won't get any disagreement from me.
Okay. And how were you able to design a regulatory structure that was easy to implement the various oversight and enforcement aspects and manage their costs?
I don't want to represent in any way that it was easy. I would concur. I would also suggest that my colleagues in New Jersey at the time would probably also not call it easy. Any regulation of any new technology presents questions, concerns by the incumbent players, but this has been the hallmark of gaming regulations since the late 70s. In the 1950s, that foundation was laid, but beginning in the 1970s and after, when technology really started to affect our business, each and every time we've taken evolutionary steps. For example, slot machines used to be mechanical devices, then they became proprietary software written only by the people supplied that. Today, most of it's PC technology. That's an example of the evolution of the technology. Each one of those presents risks and uncertainties, but in each case, I think the gaming regulators have rose to the occasion, created the right technical standards, and often we overcorrect and then back off. So I wouldn't characterize any of the work that my colleagues have done over the years as easy. But they have great experience in doing it.
Well, do you think that Nevada's experience and Nevada's regulatory standards could be used as an example for other states?
Well, clearly I made those comments in my prepared remarks. If compliance is the goal, and if you talk to any regulator, that's always their desire, right? We want our regulated people to comply with the rules and the regulations. Anytime you diverge, having wildly different standards from state to state, that creates potential conflicts and issues. So to the degree that regulators cooperate, which they often do, the industry, the players, the state, everyone benefits from that. Wildly different standards can create issues, but generally speaking, many states, Nevada, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Mississippi, have all been very cooperative, and the independent test labs also contribute to that base of knowledge that says what's the most efficient way to regulate, what can create the outcome, and we're constantly at that effort. It never goes away. Every time a new piece of technology comes along, it presents new challenges, and I think the industry, to its credit, deserves praise for the fact that you don't see widespread scandal in our industry. I think that's something to be proud of.
Chair, and Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter 31 letters for the record supporting states' rights to regulate online gambling.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, along the same lines of questioning as Mr. Palmer, and this is a panel-wide question starting with Mr. Campbell, is there a foolproof method developed by the states or anyone else to prevent minors from online gambling? Is there an app? Is there a method that has been proven by each state, by a state or the federal government, that can detect the age of the participant at the online gambling site? And I'll start with you, Mr. Campbell.
At this time, I'm not aware of any particular technology that can specifically do that.
Okay. Mr. Wilson?
No, sir, I'm unaware of any technology, and I could probably bring an expert in here to contradict others.
Sure. Mr. Klein, are you aware of any?
I'm not aware of any.
Mr. Liparelli?
I have an affliction, having been in the industry for 20 years. The goal of gaming regulation is always to set the bar appropriately high. I don't think I haven't met that coder yet that can write perfect software. I wish I could. It would have solved a lot of headaches for me in the past. But generally speaking, operators, with respect to regulated online space, have set the bar unusually high. If the ambition of a gambler is to access a site and they're going to go through the panoply of requirements of a legal regulated site, they'll probably get to the second or third entry point in the site and move on back to their illegal site. So the quick answer to your question is there are outlets for those kinds of people to play today. Those are the illegal operators. The legal operators put in a panoply of requirements, and there's no guarantee that a minor could ever access a site. But generally speaking, the standards are quite high.
Now, you and I have heard the horror story of a minor getting a hold to maybe a parent's credit card and running up thousands of dollars worth of debt on these sites. And it's too late by the time the parent finds out about it. So, I mean, that happens. That actually happens. And it gives me pause and makes me wonder, do the states have a handle on the regulation of this type of online gaming?
Well, this is where I go into my, usually my commentary about that risk exists in all consumer businesses to the extent you're transacting, and gaming is really no different. The only argument I would make is that in the case of gaming, typically the standards that we require are significantly greater than what you would see in any consumer transaction out there. You can buy all kinds of things online, and it doesn't require any of the kinds of protections that our industry have put in place.
Sure, but it's easy for you to detect a person's age in a brick-and-mortar facility, which is how gambling originally got started in this country.
And there are prosecutions each and every year in the various states that allow brick-and-mortar for minors violating that law.
For sure, but I'd just be curious as to how many prosecutions occur in the online aspect of gambling.
I know that
for
the
my-
colleagues that I have talked to have told me that, and it was my concern when we adopted our regulations, in the conversations I've had with them as recently within the last 30 days, they do not cite that as an issue that's causing them distress. They have not been warned. They have not been told of horror stories of that kind of thing happening. So I can only go by what their personal experiences are that they've relayed to me.
Okay, any other panelists have any anecdotal evidence? Mr.
This
Wilson?
is very, very anecdotal, Representative. My 7-year-old is fond of hacking my iTunes account and downloading video games. I don't know what would stop him if he had a penchant for gambling on my iPhone, if I had an app on there. So that's more anecdotal than anything.
And probably with these new fantasy football leagues and all of that, I'm sure that that young people get excited about participating in that forum too.
Mr. Campbell, let me start with you. Can you just briefly describe a casino-grade geolocation system to me?
No, I do not have information about that. I cannot provide information on that.
On a casino-grade geolocation system?
No, I am not familiar with that system.
Okay, okay. Well, let me ask you, are you aware that the Georgia Lottery Corporation conducts third-party penetration testing of their geolocation and age verification solutions? And this is very important to me. I know it's somewhat specific to my state, but the Georgia Lottery has been very successful, and by statute, all of those proceeds from that go to education. So we're looking at potentially losing $10 million in revenue directly to education. So that's why it's of concern to me.
Certainly, no, I am not familiar with the Georgia Lottery or its processes.
Okay. Senator, let me ask you, if we were able to control where online lottery sales can be done and the age of the person who purchases those tickets online, if we're able to control that, then how is it the federal government's problem? Why should the federal government be getting involved in it?
I'm not sure I'm totally tracking the question, but the states that establish their statutes, regulations, and technical standards, I have found over 20 years of experience, those local requirements, those local technical standards usually address the resident issues that crop up with those regulatory agencies. So in the case of an online lottery business, there will be particular requirements that may not be what you see in a traditional casino environment. So if there are specific elements related to lottery, I'm sure the lottery players in that game will contribute to very detailed debates on what should and shouldn't be included. In the case of lottery specifically, it's no different than what we saw with our online accounts. The one difference that they may decide to adopt is some of the registration requirements that we required in our state. That may not be the case, but that is one example that could bring greater transparency. But those tools are available, and they're getting better and better each day.
So the tools to be able to identify where the ticket is bought, where it's originating from, and the age, verification of the age of the person who's purchasing it.
I don't see the difference between any purchase transaction and any gaming transaction. It all comes in the form of complete tracking, so that I think those are very similar. As it relates to age verification, those will be continued challenges. There's more and more technology coming on board, but you probably shouldn't be able to register in the first place for an online transaction unless you've provided your identifiers, your personal account information, your access to whatever card you're using to transact. Again, building that wall as high as you can so that to the extent that a parent is going to then turn over that account information is no different than a parent being irresponsible in any other consumer transaction.
Okay, well, gentlemen, my concern is this, okay? I don't want to lose $10 million in revenue to education. I mean, it's very, very important to us in the state of Georgia. It's worked well. And we feel like we're able to control where that ticket originates from, where that purchase originates from. We feel like we're able to control or to verify the age of the purchaser. So why come to Washington, D.C. and for me to say, no, I'm not going to allow you to do it if we're able to control that? Mr. Klein?
Yeah, what you're talking about is intrastate I think. And what we're talking, I think, for the most part, is interstate issues with regard to gambling.
Well, let me get clarification then. Do you have any problem with intrastate?
I don't have a problem if Georgia has a lottery and they run it intrastate and they regulate it intrastate. Nebraska has a lottery also that we have intrastate, and we get the money goes to education. But I don't think that's not what I guess I'm talking about here.
Okay, okay, just want to make.
Yeah.
Mr. Wilson?
We have a lottery too, Representative, and absolutely have no problem with that. This is absolutely within the borders of each individual state. We're talking about cross-state borders, online gambling.
Fair enough. I just want to make sure because, quite honestly, I have concerns about that as well. But again, for the third time, I just don't want to interrupt something that is working so well in our state and that we feel like we have under control. So I just want to get clarification on that, okay?